Before you start this episode, this is just a reminder that History Hack does have a Patreon account and a Ko-fi account as well. You can either register to subscribe and throw us a few quid every month, or simply buy us enough caffeine to continue through to the next episode, because frankly, we run on fumes most of the time. Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. This week marks the 80th anniversary of something, doesn't it, Charlie? What is it the 80th anniversary of?
Well, I'm very much learning this week. It's the 80th anniversary of Operation Chastise, Alex.
Yes, it is. Which apparently, this is interesting to me because apparently my great uncle's squadron was involved in testing stuff, but I've never looked in to see if that's true or what. But he's not 617 squadron. So who do we have?
Today we have Richard Morris. He's Emeritus Professor of Archaeology at the University of Huddersfield and the former Director of the Council for British Archaeology. He's written on archaeology, but he's also the author of the definitive biography of Guy Gibson. He's here today to talk to us all about his new book, which coincides with the 80th anniversary of Operation Chastise. It's called Dambuster, Barnes Wallis, An Engineer's Life. Hello, Richard. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning to you.
We're doing completely what we always do, aren't we, Charlie? And not doing what everyone else is going to do, which is talk about the actual operation ad nauseum. We're going to go in a different direction.
Yeah, I think that's much more fun. It's definitely much more History Hack to come in from the other approach and look at it from a different angle.
Yeah.
Richard, there's so much more to this man than the bouncing bomb. We're going to get into all of that. So let's start with where he came from. What's his background? We're talking about the late Victorian period, aren't we?
We are, yes. He goes back. I mean, he's already in his teens when Queen Victoria dies. So he is a Victorian, and he stays Victorian right into the 20th century. So that by the time he gets to the end of his life, much of his thinking is still on the tram lines of the British Empire. In the two families that joined to create him, he is coming from a world of school teaching, of private school education, where he on his mother's side of quite a kind of progressive kind of learning through experiment rather than learning by rote. On his father's side, his father has a raw deal. His mother dies just a couple of days after his birth. And his father, who is an evangelical clergyman, very evangelical, really puts him aside, and he goes off to his grandparents for 6 years, and he's then brought up by the family of a clergyman on the Lincolnshire coast, about as far away from anywhere as you could get.
Wow. And
he grows up really in a kind of solitary world, with a few £1,000s set aside for his education. He goes to study medicine and to cut a long story short, becomes a GP, initially in Derbyshire because he can't afford to practice in London. And so the mother comes from this educational, world, father from evangelical Christianity, loneliness and Christianity. And we take it from there.
Incredible, isn't it? Like, I think it's basically a direct contemporary of Winston Churchill, isn't he?
Well, yes, they overlap. Also, their paths crisscross. An early letter from Wallis to his mother when Wallis is an apprentice on the Isle of Wight with a shipbuilding company. He goes to hear Winston Churchill speak at the election in 1910. I can't remember. End of the first decade of the 20th century. And he doesn't like him. He's not impressed by his speech. Churchill is then the cabinet minister who cancels the building of the first airship he works on.
At the Admiralty.
In 1915.
Yeah.
He's then at the Admiralty, First Lord. And he then interferes. Churchill, he's Secretary of State for the Colonies or something like that by 1922-23. So in that government, he is also intervening in the proposals to build long-distance airships. So I think Wallis never really kind of forgot people who got in his path, and so Churchill is not one of his favourite people. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it, that you talk about that imperial mindset. And so you've already mentioned 1915. So I guess really the first big formative thing that happens to him as an adult that's going to sort of shape who he is the First World War. And he's in the Navy for about 61 days, isn't he? And then he's done.
Yeah. Well, if we wind back just a little bit, because he doesn't go into aviation at the start of his working life. He leaves school at 16. And he goes off to work as an apprentice, first of all in a London shipbuilder, and then he moves to the Isle of Wight. And he's there, first as an apprentice and then as a young man in the drawing office, until 1913. His formative years, his sort of middle 20s, are spent really on the shop floor, getting dirty, getting up early, getting his nails torn as he changed bits of metal in the engine rooms of destroyers that he's building. And he goes into airships really through a friendship with one of his colleagues. And he doesn't really get started therefore on aviation until the First World War started. His first action the day after war was declared was to attempt to join the Navy, and Vickers, for whom he then worked, refused to let him go. They say, you're too important to what we're doing, so he's kept back. But the cancellation does mean he can of the airship 1915 means he can initially he joins the army, he joins the Artist Rifles, and I think he's quite happy there. Because he liked quite like being anonymous in groups of people and just getting on with the job. And he liked the idea of soldiering. He was a very fit man. We get the impression from the film that he's a kind of rather abstract, cerebral person. He was very, very physical. If you look at any picture of him with his shirt off, he is fantastically muscular. And he's very, very energetic and outdoors, all his life. So he likes soldiering. It's a good idea. But then when they restart work on the airship later that year, he's put into the Navy, partly because nobody quite understands who is building the airship. Is it the Admiralty or is it Vickers? And for a few weeks, he's in the Navy while they think it's the Admiralty, and then it goes back to Vickers. It's a convoluted story, but, and then he's there for the rest of the war building airships.
What kind of life does he forge for himself after the war?
Well, initially he's still working at Barrow Furnace, which is where Vickers have their big airship shed and where the airships are laid down and built. And for 2 years he is working on another airship, the R-80, which is the first British airship, which is, if you like, progressive and original. We need to go back a step, because the airships being built during the Great War, by and large, but they're basically Zeppelin clones. They're not that original in the way that they're constructed. Somebody said that Britain never really had an airship policy during the First World War, merely a series of reactions to what the Germans did. And this is pretty much true. And the R-80 is the first airship to break out of that. And it's essentially Wallis's baby. But it comes too late to take part in the war. And it's not big enough to become a successful civilian airship. So, and it only flies for a few tens of hours before it's mothballed. He has a nervous breakdown. Just after the war, and goes really off the radar for some months. In 1921, it's clear that orders for military ships, technology, airships are all in abeyance because of the state of the economy. The UK has come out of the war victorious, but in penury, and so Vickers let him go in the early 20s. He goes first off to catch up on his education by doing a degree at the University of London, and then he goes off to Switzerland to teach in what is called the Eton of Switzerland. It's a school for English speaking young men, and he's back again in May 20. So he's there for about 6 months. But by this time, the big life-changing event has happened, which is that having really not had anything to do with young ladies since childhood. He there's a very complex relationship with his mother, who dies when he's in 1911. So she dies in her 50s, and he is desolated. He never really gets over this, and he's in a kind of depression until he meets his 17-year-old cousin-in-law, who and falls in love with her really overnight, and has a long period of a courtship of several years, in which, not unsurprisingly, her father takes quite a dim view of a bloke in his late 30s pursuing his 17-year-old daughter. But together they win through and live happily ever after. So but during this, we're now into the sort of 1923, 24, 25 period. And what is happening now is that he's a kind of shuttlecock on the backs of government and various people who are attempting to set up an imperial airship transport scheme. They can't decide how to do it, and because there are successive elections, quick elections, Bonar Law dies, followed, there's a succession of elections in which Labour come and go. So policies is constantly being rethought and refashioned, sometimes over a period of weeks. So having a settled project, it's a bit like HS2 actually, having a settled project to agree what you're going to do for the next 5 years is difficult. If you've got Bonar Law, then Baldwin goes to the country, then that's October, that November, because although he's got a majority, he wants, rather like Theresa May back in whenever it was, 2017, he's got a majority, but he wants support from the country for his programme. And they're just about to sign the deal to build these airships when they don't lose the election, but Parliament is hung, and then MacDonald comes in the following January because they lose their Queen's speech, I beg your pardon, their King's speech vote. And then the MacDonald government has a new kind of approach, which is to build two airships, one being built by the government and one by private enterprise. And by the time the airships actually sort of are being built, Baldwin is back. So, you couldn't make any of this up. And some of it feels quite rings some bells, actually.
Right.
Going on the last couple of years. So he's in the thick of all that, but in a very unstable industrial situation where nobody quite knows what's going to happen. Yeah. And then they build the airship. Yeah.
I think we can safely say that he's not going to have any problems finding a job or funding as of 1939. So how does the Second World War begin for him? Where do we find him and what happens? Well,
he is where he's been for the previous 10 years, which is after the R100 airship. Or perhaps we can come back to the R100 airship in a little while, because as you mentioned Cardington, and one of the big discoveries writing the book was the effect on the nation of the loss of the R101. From 1930 through to 1939, he is at Weybridge with Vickers Aviation as their, for most of that time, as their structures designer. He's in charge of structures. Aircraft up to the early 30s are made of wood, mostly, and they are made of box frame trusses. And he is looking for new ways of building aircraft. And he arrives at this idea of opposingly wound helical meshes of light alloy, which create a tubular structure, which allows the space inside to be used for people like cargo, bombs, crew, passengers. And he builds a succession of aircraft, not just him. He is providing the structure. The airframe designs are coming from his colleague Rex Pearson, and they are successively the Wellesley, the Wellington, which is perhaps one of the most famous bombers to the Lancaster of the Second World War, and is actually the only bomber that was being built in 1939 that is still being built in 1945. So it is like the Spitfire. It is capable of development and renewal. So he's doing that. Right at the outbreak of war, he's drawn into a project to try to counter magnetic mines, which are being triggered by magnetic fields cast by ships from the air. But he is then his day job for the next 2 or 3 years. There are a succession of projects, none of which really quite work out. There's a high altitude Wellington. It's a Wellington with a pressure cabin he works on. Britain is very fearful of very high altitude aircraft, which can outfly fighters and can outfly ground defences, anti-aircraft fire. That threat actually fades away as the war passes, but early on the air staff are very keen to have an aircraft that can fly very high. He's also involved with a high altitude fighter, which is built but never really comes to good. And he's looked at, there's another aircraft after the Wellington comes the Warwick, which is actually commissioned almost at the same time. It's a bigger aircraft and has a community of parts are common to both aeroplanes. So the idea is you have an economic overlap between the two. You're turning out the same pieces. And from that there comes an even bigger aircraft, initially thought of as a super Warwick with 4 engines, which becomes the Windsor, which is still being trialled at the end of the war, and then goes no further. So he's involved with a series of aircraft projects, but they didn't interest him so much as an idea he has, we don't know quite when, but somewhere around about late 39, early 40, which is to bring the war to a halt by cutting off the power supply to industry. He saw very early on that the modern war depends on equipment, tanks, bullets, aircraft. Equipment is made in factories. He saw very early on that it is futile to bomb factories because you can hide them, or you can disperse their functions so that they're not all in one place, but they're spread out. Just as, the Mosquito is built by kind of piano builders and local garages and things. You can disperse production. And therefore it becomes immune to air attack or any other kind of attack, actually. And but if you like, go for the fuse box of the power supply, if you like, of the economy, and make that fail. Albert Speer, the German armaments minister, used a very telling phrase. He said, a bit like removing the ignition from a car. So the car could be intact, but it won't go because you've taken the ignition out. So that was his idea. This meant going for things like coal mines, oil storage, critical transport infrastructure. And there was no bomb then available that could do anything to harm those things significantly. So he comes up with the idea of, instead of dropping lots of small bombs which explode on the surface, of actually dropping bigger bombs that drill into the ground and cause mayhem from underneath. Because the pressure pulse of an explosion, if you look at the history of an explosion from the first instant it detonates to what happens, there's a radiating pulse of energy. And if you can pass that through a medium that is not air but denser, like water or the ground, you can magnify the effect of what it can do. So his idea was to bring the economy to a halt by cutting off its power. The idea was rejected because if the air staff had accepted this, it would have meant their whole previous 10 years of planning was wrong, and they weren't going to do it. And by this time, too, Wallis he becomes quite in putting forward his ideas, and this is a case in point in mid 1940. He becomes over-optimistic to the point of mania. There's one letter in which he says, look, you only need about 30 of these aircraft to drop this big bomb, that I will build, because that'll stop the war. And we can hand build them. You don't need to build them on production line, if we cut corners. He's massively over-optimistic at times. And other times he's very realistic, but he has swings of euphoria and depression. And so he is he becomes obsessed by the idea of inflicting economic harm on German industry by removal of its power supply. And it's that leads him to dams, because dams generate electricity through water, hydroelectric power. And that takes him towards dams as time.
How then do you rate his most famous idea compared to his whole body of work? And we're talking, of course, about bouncing bomb and the Dambusters raid?
Well, clearly it was an extraordinary idea. It was also a very visual idea, and of course the film that is made, released in 1955, uses actually the bomb you see in the film was actually not the one they used against the dams. It was a smaller version that was intended for attacking ships. And it brings together all kinds of things that the British likes, or decisive moments in history, but like St. George killing the dragon, and it's a group of specialist flyers, a special squadron, special equipment, so all of that is, I think that my basic thought about it is that it's a complete miracle that it worked, that it all came together and that they broke 2 dams. That never ceases to astonish me. It is so improbable. Not the least because the time in which they had to do it was limited by the level of the water in the reservoir. And also by security considerations, that if they didn't do it within a few weeks, in early 1943, it couldn't be done for another year. The war would have moved on. So it was a now or never thing. It did involve the setting aside of a lot of resources, of aircraft, of aircrew, of planning. It was an extraordinary thing. Whether the war could have been pursued in a more realistic way, and not by other means, is another conversation. But it was an outstanding episode, yeah. But also one that captures the popular imagination, and I think that's what has kept it live ever since.
How did he rate the outcome of the raid? Was he happy?
Well, he was. There's 2 answers to that question. I think he was shattered by the losses. Around about tea time on 16th of May 1943, he's talking to a room full of people. Next morning, 12 hours later, nearly half of them are not there. And he becomes tearful through them. Well, partly because he hasn't had any sleep, but he becomes really quite emotional about all this. And he goes back to his wife, and who writes a letter to a friend next day and says, Barnes is so upset, he's killed so many people. And he wasn't thinking about the however many died in Germany. We don't know how many died, somewhere between 13 and 1,600 people killed there. He was thinking about the crews. I think it shook him. And perhaps shows his sort of naivety about the sort of tactical implications of it, because it was a small force and only barely large enough to do the job. Which is why the job was left unfinished, because the Zorpa Dam and the Myrna were a set, and really you had to deal with both side by side, and they never broke the Zorpa. So he was shaken by the losses, but I think he was euphoric about well, I don't know if euphoric's the right word. He was felt vindicated by the other 2 dams, because if you think about it, he'd had to convince the air staff, the chiefs of staff, and others that this was a project worth undertaking. They had set aside special aircraft which had to be built specially, another kind of Lancaster, built. He had a lot of economic and material resources that had to be diverted to do this trip. And if it had failed, he would have been regarded as someone who'd simply set the war back by another 6 weeks by wasting time and effort. So the fact that I think the sense of relief when the message came through that they'd done it, I think that vindicated what he'd been doing. Yeah, relief, I think, was the big sense.
I mean, he's only one man at the end of the day, isn't he? Yeah, I think it'd be very unusual for someone who invents something that has such destructive power, even the power to shorten a conflict, not to feel the weight of, not only the crew, but like you say, the lives on the ground as well. You've got to feel, it's got to be just the most confusing, conflicting range of emotions that you feel.
Yeah. And also because the film simplifies the story, you don't know, for example, from the film, well, you do hear it at one moment, but you don't really sort of see it in action, that they're actually after 5 dams that night. That was the sort of, the optimal outcome would have been all five, and certainly the three. You don't see from the film the fact that he was actually surrounded by an enormous range of people who were very supportive, including Avro's chief designer, Roy Chadwick, who really did a lot of work behind the scenes to make it happen in an unbelievably short space of time. The people trialing the weapon, the people at Vickers who were building the prototypes and testing them, working very, very long hours. There's a whole committee of experts behind him who are giving advice about all kinds of aspects. So he really is surrounded by a lot of people, some of whom, at least, I think, do have confidence that this is going to work. We know that some of the others were sceptical, but including Harris, I think, who thought that the whole project was mad, and I think was relieved also when it came good, because he thought that it could be justified after all, because he was desperate to. He said Harris's force at this time was not the big, enormous force that he got in 1944-45, and the various parts of the war machine were constantly trying to erode his assets by taking his aircraft and using them for other things. So Coastal Command wanted Lancasters, for example. The Navy wanted this, and anything which diverted Lancasters from what he saw as their proper job, which was laying waste to German cities, was he thought was problematic. And he certainly saw this project like that. Yeah.
We start getting into all kinds of things that in themselves sound like they would make great movies. So we've got fake limbs, silent submarines. Yeah. What's he up to?
Well, his main projects after the war, his main, in fact, there is one underlying project after the war, which is high-speed flights over very long distances. He wanted to join up the Commonwealth in the time from here to Melbourne, say, in the time it might take you to watch the in-flight movie. Now, supersonics have all kinds of problems in the 50s and 60s. You can make things travel beyond the speed of sound, but you have to put a lot of work in on fortifying the structures against heat.
Yeah.
And the fact that different structures of different shapes were needed for different parts of the supersonic envelope, and which is why he comes up with the idea of an aircraft that could change shape in flight. And he spends the whole of the late 40s and all the way through to 1960 working on that. And then there's another shape-shifting aircraft around about 1960 that which is a spin-out from what he's been doing. None of these things are ever built at full scale. I mean, they are tried in large radio-controlled model form, but the models are bigger than, say, small light aircraft now. So, they're and they do work. And one of the amazing things about them is that whereas as a result, largely of his flag bearing for shape-shifting aircraft, that other aircraft go on to be built later in the century. His aircraft, the wings move independently. If you look at Tornado, the wings go kind of just do that when they change shape. His aircraft go in different directions, like a bird. And and this has never really been exploited at the scale intended. So by the end of his life, he was thinking of aircraft that could fly 5 times the speed of sound. He thought Concorde was a digression because it was a hardened version of things that could just about go supersonic, rather than the more elegant forms that he thought that were within reach, that could take you to very high speeds at very high altitudes, where of course the temperatures are lower. That's really where he is. But along the way, he's doing other things. He helps to design a radio telescope in Australia, where his main idea is absorbed into the scheme. The telescope wasn't built by him, and he didn't design it. He did produce a design for it, but his main idea for how you point the telescope, because telescopes are always moving following their targets, was his, which was, and that form is still used by a number of telescopes now around the world. The prosthetic limbs came partly out of personal experience. He had a nephew who was a doctor who died young, and I think it was out of loyalty to his memory for doing something for medicine that he accepted invitation to be president of this new institute for medical engineering, which has now has now evolved into this mock charity called Design Ability, which is to produce design solutions for different kinds of disabilities. And he was doing that in the midst of his high-speed flight thinking, but because he kind of thought out each idea from, he was almost a contrarian. That's to say, if someone had done something one way, there must be a better way of doing it, and that's the way he would look for.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that Jodrell Bank, has got two towers with a telescope, between them, whereas so his doesn't. His is simply on a central pedestal. And I think he has a wonderful. He did a charity broadcast, TV broadcast for what is now Design Ability in about 1971, 72, in which he says, here am I trying to design an aircraft to fly at 5 times the speed of sound from here to Australia. And yet some people, to design something to mean they can just put one foot in front of the other would be a wonderful thing. And is no less difficult. So that's how he approached that. That one step could be just as much of a challenge as travelling the world.
There's something, I think, Da Vinci-esque about him. I mean, it's one thing inventing stuff in one field and being good at it, which he clearly is in aviation, but then the ability to open your mind and apply that to so many different fields and change the way they operate is quite special, I think.
Well, that's, I wish I'd thought of that. The Da Vinci comparison.
It could have been the subtitle, couldn't it? Britain's Da Vinci.
So there we go. But at the very end of the book, at the end I had to put it into an endnote because the book, I had to cut over 30,000.
Oh no, so painful.
To make it fit the size. There's a lot of material that never made it. But one of the things that I came across was a quote from Machiavelli, who said, there is nothing more dangerous than doing something completely original, because everyone around you has a vested interest in doing what you did last time, but just doing it better. So optimizing a design solution is what everyone has an interest in. So all the companies out there now, British Aerospace, BAE Systems, of making it better, but completely. Whereas if you do something completely new and completely different, you are upsetting the status quo and all the vested interests that exist in the status quo, and people will come after you. And the last people in the world who have an interest in completely original solutions are politicians, because their horizons are quite close, like 2, 3, 4 years. They want guaranteed results, and so do civil servants. Civil servants are not the enemies that are portrayed by some. They're people who make things happen. But they do have a vested, and certainly back in the mid-20th century, your career as a civil servant depended on you not fouling up. And therefore, if you backed a project that came a cropper, and one of Wallis's projects might have done, and you were associated with it, they would mark your card. Therefore, people were frightened to go with completely original solutions. So after the war, there's a final factor here, which is, well, not the final one, but another factor. It's the Cold War, which of course from late 40s until late 80s is the dominant influence on foreign policy and international relations. And the Cold War are constantly leapfrogging, the Warsaw Pact and NATO constantly leapfrogging each other in what they can do technically. And they don't want a solution that might become good in 20 years and be the most brilliant thing ever invented. They want a solution that will work in 5 years' time. And Wallis's schemes didn't fit that pattern. They were longer range projects, and they were dangerous because they might not work in the way intended. So optimizing what you did last time rather than being completely original is the dominant influence in industry and politics and international relations. And Wallis isn't part of that. He's looking further ahead.
You've mentioned the cousin-in-law and the marriage, but the sense I got from the book, which I want to go back and read more slowly than when I'm prepping for an episode because there's so much to take in, is that as a biographer, he's not an easy man to get a handle on, is he? Because you say something about him and then you'll find a contradiction as well. But his private life and his personal life, he's not easy, is he?
I don't think anyone is easy. I think we're all complicated people. I mean, some people's headlines might be more kind of, bigger than others, but it was quite interesting. I had the privilege of talking to 3 of his 4 children, and getting to know one of them very well, and another one, not as well, because I haven't talked to her so much, but she's still with us. And it's quite interesting that the 2 sisters gave me completely, well, not different pictures, but they gave me complementary aspects of him. The elder one was at school, boarding school, while much of this was going on, much of the wartime struggles were in progress. And so was seeing him intermittently in school holidays, whereas the younger one hardly ever saw him because he was always never came home till 9 o'clock after she'd gone to bed. So there are different perspectives. I think he like a lot of men in the 30s, regarded child rearing as a woman's work. So he, provided the children were turned up kept themselves clean at meal times, turned up, didn't interrupt adults, took part in family chores like washing up and clearing up and doing tasks without complaining. He was pretty much happy to let them do whatever they wanted outdoors, which they did. So they spent a real kind of swallows and Amazons childhood out climbing trees, lighting fires, riding bicycle for 90 miles. 2 of his young teenagers go off on holiday on their own on bicycles in the Lake District in 1940. So, just as Britain is about to be invaded, they're off up and cycling about in the Lake District on their own. 13 and a 14-year-old, 13, 15-year-old. There are limits because he is so committed. He's a very conscientious man, and he's working flat out for much of the time. That there are limits to how much time he will give the children, except when they're on holiday and they go away for 3 or 4 weeks to Dorset, and he can return to being someone who could deal with family things, jokes, adventures, outdoor fun. He was very, very preoccupied. But there was another layer to that, which was that I think he was so in love with his cousin-in-law that other people who took up his time were in a way kind of denying him her company, and therefore he didn't much like visitors coming to dinner or people like that because they interrupted. They occupied time that he could otherwise be spending with his wife.
That's quite romantic in a weird way.
It's very romantic. They were completely devoted, and their letters. And one of the privileges of writing the book was reading the letters. Things like you open a letter. They say, "Do you remember when we did this?" And they look back to what they did when they went to the theatre or whatever. But you open one letter and you find the program of the show they went to, and then in the program, the rose he puts between the pages to give to her, on the night that they went. When he's in Switzerland and their first letters are coming to and fro, Molly's father is very strict. This is very Victorian parenting. He said, well, you can write to my daughter, provided you don't talk about feelings. No feelings to be allowed. So they talk about the weather and stuff. In fact, they call them the weathery letters because that's all they can talk about. But they find ways around it. He's up on the side of some mountain near Chillon in early 1923, and he finds a spring flower, and he puts it in the letter. It doesn't say anything about it, but when she writes back to him next time, she sends a spring flower back to him, and these flowers are still in the letters. So so he's a complete romantic. But also it's not the kind of superficial romance that sort of wears off when you get to 50. I mean, they were still doing this right to the end.
That's really lovely. With all this in mind, Richard, let's talk about Michael Redgrave's portrayal of Barnes Wallis in the 1955 film Dambusters, which I'm sure lots of our listeners have adored throughout their lives. How true to life was that portrayal?
Well, when Redgrave and Wallis first met, Michael Anderson introduced him. He said, look, this is the man we think is going to play you in the film. This would be about 1953, 54. They both burst out laughing because because neither of them thought it looked remotely when Redgrave, who was a kind of very kind of with it bloke, saw this man with sort of white hair, and so he thought, well, but Redgrave quickly convinced him that with some powder and makeup and, he could do it. I think the answer to your question is that what Redgrave did was to take selectively parts of Wallis. Like, he could be self-effacing, he could be quiet, he could be, come up with a piece of barbed wit, if he wanted to. He could be, patient, and sort of self-effacing. He could be all those things. But he left out all the other things that Wallis also was or could be, like losing his temper in meetings, becoming impatient with people who didn't keep up intellectually with what he was telling them, not forgiving people if they'd crossed him 10 years before, like Churchill, the airship, always harbouring some sort of feeling, remembering mark their card, of being, as I've described, being subject to swings of mood whereby he could become completely irrational in his optimism, saying, oh, we can do this, we can do that, when in fact those around him could see it was going to take a lot more than that. So Redgrave left all that out and left you this residue of things that were true to life but did not themselves add up to the man.
So Richard, I want to ask you about Barnes Wallis and the tragedy of the R101 airship. We're very involved with it here in Bedfordshire. We have the memorial at Cardington. How was he involved in that? Well,
on one level, hardly at all, because his airship, the R100, was already built and flying, and in July 1930 it flies the Atlantic. It goes to Canada. It has some narrow squeak on the way, but it gets there safely and it comes back safely. And for that reason, historians looking backward have depicted it as a successful project. The R101 is less efficient aerodynamically, and is problematic in various ways mechanically. But having built it, and as it's the government, sponsored, built by the Royal Airship Works, which is what Cardington was then, Thompson, who wants to attend the Imperial Conference, and fly to India and come back to the Imperial Conference, almost like, coming down from a cloud, so to speak. He says, look, I really want this flight to go ahead, and I want to be on it. And I think everyone close to R101 knew that it wasn't ready. It had not done the necessary tests that would be expected of it, that they would have to cut short that test flying. It had already been grounded, cut in half, and had a new gas cell put in to give it more lift. The small modifications that are talked about in the press, 1929, 1930, are actually quite big modifications. So, I think everyone who was close to it knew that they were, this was going to be a very marginal project. So let's say marginal in the sense of being risky. But no one was in a position, the people who could have said, no, it's not ready, it's premature, wouldn't stand up to him and thought that giving him the answer he wanted was the preferable solution. So they did. And, therefore the Director of Airship Development and indeed the Air Member for Science, who was Dowding actually, who'd only just imposed, but didn't know much about airships, really gave the answer that was expected of them. And the rest was a catastrophe, because it crashed a few hours after taking off in bad weather in France. You mentioned Cardington, yeah?
Yes.
Which is near where you are. Well, when I looked at the circumstances of the loss of the R101, Wallis told his first biographer a series of things that, when I looked into them, turned out not to be true. He said he was excluded from the memorial service, for example, and that nobody from R100 was invited. Well, it's not true. The entire crew was sitting in the Whispering Gallery, and the entire crew of R100 were actually standing by the grave at Cardington when they put the victims in.
Yeah.
But I hadn't looked until I went first of all, I read the papers from that week, and then I looked at the newsreel film and other things, that this was the biggest emotional event in the life of the nation since probably between the Unknown Soldier and Diana. It was extraordinary, and it went on for days. And so when the trains coming up from London up to Bedford with the coffins, many of the dead were unrecognisable because they were burned so badly, which is why they're all buried in one grave at Cardington. The track side is lined with people, wall-to-wall people at level crossings, on stations, viaducts, watching. And it is an enormous event. And I asked myself why it was such an emotional shock. And part of the answer is what they'd done the year before, because when R101 first flies in 1929, October, it is depicted by the media specialists in the Air Ministry as a sensational success. And it like Gloriana on Progress, they fly over Sandringham. It flies over the industrial cities where Lord Thompson, and the Labour government has got their MPs. It is paraded over London. Prince Edward flies alongside it. And it is almost, you can hardly get through a day without something new being, and the nation is sort of wound up into this state of inspired enthusiasm for this great new form of.
So what's the one innovation of his that you think deserves more attention?
Oh, that's a hard one. Because there are a lot of them. I think that there are things that we haven't talked about. Lots of things that deserve more attention, not because if we'd followed through on them, they would have changed the way aviation works, but just simply because we shouldn't forget that they ever happened. One example is his after the just at the end of the war, 1945. I'm glad you've asked this, because the book proposes a refined answer to a problem, which is that many people think that his use of radio control models for variable geometry aircraft after the war comes from his shock at the loss of all the aircrew at the Dambuster and not wanting to kill more pilots and aircrew. I think, that may be true, but I think that the moment that he realizes this for real is in early 1945, when one of the Vickers test pilots is killed. Maurice Longbottom is killed. He's flying a Warwick, trying to work out why a phenomenon known as rudder stall was affecting this type of aircraft and how it was working aerodynamically. And he crashes on the main railway line going past Brooklands across 4 parallel tracks with the aircraft full of fuel resting on the live wires, and it explodes. And he was, what Wallis tells us in that letters to other people, that Maurice Longbottom was very close to him. They talked privately about all kinds of ideas that Wallis had, and Longbottom would give him responses that he wouldn't get from other pilots. He was having creative discussions. So he really lost the kind of surrogate son here, and I think he wasn't going to kill another test pilot. One of the things he sets about almost immediately, within weeks, is to design part of space on the ground. If you go to Brooklands, it's still there, you can go and see it. He designs a thing called the stratosphere chamber, which is a great space. You go online and have a look. It's enormous. You can put an aircraft inside it, and you can pump out the air and let the temperatures down to where they would be at 60,000 feet or 100,000 feet. You can create the upper parts of the atmosphere and near space on the ground and test things like what do they do under these conditions without putting people at risk or without putting the structures at risk. And that was in use for 30 years. It's so big it was just left when British Aircraft Corporation left the site around about 1980, 81. And it's now back in use for visitors. You can go and see it. It's extraordinary. So, it's a classic way of, Wallis outflanking a problem by providing a solution that there were things not dissimilar being built in Germany late in the war, that may also have provided inspiration here. So that's one example. But, I think probably the work he was doing between about 1955 and early 60s, a succession of ideas about with aircraft with new configurations, square fuselages, multiple winglets that could amalgamate or come apart, isothermal flying, where you build an aircraft not to withstand heat, but you build design a flight profile that will allow you to use lighter materials so that they don't get heated up, because you take them up into higher space where the air is thinner, and then you go faster. Things like that, that have never been followed through. I mean, interestingly, hypersonic flight is back on the agenda. There are projects now looking at these things. But here we are, he's been dead, 40 years, 45 years. So many of the things he was talking about in a very, very upfront way are just beginning to happen. Behind your question, there's another one, which is that if he's that important as an engineer, there must be a legacy. And internationally, where is it? Or are we not just thinking about someone who was famous in another British war films, or patron saint of Brexit type idea? And I think part of this is that some of the legacy hasn't yet arrived, because the projects themselves never went the distance. And of course, many of the ideas are being reworked, but quite a lot of what he was talking about 50, 60, 70 years ago is current again now, because we had not yet reached that point.
So in that way, he very much is the British
Da Vinci.
He also,
I think without him, it's a question whether variable geometry flight would have taken off in the way, sorry for the pun, in the way it did in the late 20th century, because he kept that idea alive when other people thought it was too problematic. Although if you read some of the historiography of variable geometry of flight, particularly by American authors, he's been written out of the story. Some places the name doesn't even appear. It's quite interesting. History being written by the victors, yes.
On that note, Richard, thank you so much for joining us. I feel like we've done something really good for the 80th anniversary, which is look in depth at the man who basically is the entire reason that there is an 80th anniversary of Operation Chastise. The book is out now, and we will put it in the History Hack bookstore so that you can buy it. And we get a cut, Richard gets a cut, and Amazon don't get any money, which is just brilliant all round as far as we're concerned, because they got enough money. Richard, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.